Bon dia, good morning, buenos dias, bonjour. I'm Geri Augusto, a senior fellow in International and Public Affairs and the director of Undergraduate Development Studies at the Watson Institute. I want to add to my greetings the acknowledgement that Brown is located on the traditional and ancestral territory of the Narragansett, on a campus whose earliest buildings were in part constructed by enslaved African-descended persons. It is a particular pleasure for me to moderate this panel on Rethinking Transit, Migrant-led Challenges to Racism, Securitization, and Restricted Mobility, whose 6 participants I will introduce in turn as they speak for about 10 to 15 minutes apiece. Before we get started, I wanted to note as well that in the spirit of cross-hemispheric conversation that marks this gathering, all of the content presented during this panel will be available in Spanish and English. You'll find at the bottom of your Zoom screen an icon that allows you to choose a language channel using the interpretation button. You can toggle back and forth between channels if you wish. As always, we invite you to put your questions and comments into the Q&A feature here in Zoom. You can also put some in chat, but it'll be working across the two as the conversation unfolds. Our first speaker is Rebecca Galemba, who will present Paisanos, Refugees, Migrants, and Suspects at the Mexico-Guatemala border. Dr. Galemba is an anthropologist and associate professor at the Joseph Corbell School of International Studies at the University of Denver. She's also co-founder and co-director of the university's Center for Immigration and Policy Research, where she focuses on migration, borders, illicit networks, smuggling and Latin America, and the intersections between immigration enforcement and labor rights. Her first book, Contraband Corridor, Making a Living at the Mexico-Guatemala Border, is now available in Spanish translation as well, and explores the everyday livelihood strategies among residents along the Mexico-Guatemala border as the region has increasingly become encapsulated within hemispheric security and trade arrangements. She has also published works on the impacts of restrictive border and immigration policies on crimes committed against immigrants, access to justice, and migrant decision-making processes at the Mexico-Guatemala border. Drawing on her research regarding immigrant wage theft, she is currently writing her second book called Unjust Wages. Rebecca?
Great. I changed my title slightly, which I'm sure is not a surprise. But this presentation is based on my long-term field work. And thank you again for the introduction. It's great to be back at Brown, even if virtually. But it's based on my long-term work along a clandestine route that crosses the Mexico-Guatemala border that I've been conducting since 2006, as well as many follow-up visits. Today, I draw on border inhabitants' views about indigenous refugees from Guatemala in the 80s, as well as more recent Central American migrants, to examine how the racialization of migrant transit spaces helps reconstitute the borderlands and stabilize residents within, using Lisa Malky's concept, the national order of things, amidst the otherwise forms of often tenuous belonging and increasing insecurity that otherwise characterize the transborder space. On my last visit to the border in May of 2019, a young man I'd known since he was about 6 pointed to a sign posted on the fence on the school on the Mexican side of the border. I'd actually seen the same sign 2 summers earlier when I conducted fieldwork further south at migrant shelters at the busier Tapachula to Cunuman crossing. The sign had the UNHCR logo in the corner and featured a dark-haired man with a scruffy beard, rumpled clothing, and sandals. He struggled to carry a satchel over his head, and he appeared to be running next to a darker-skinned woman whose satchel appeared to almost be on her head, with a red skirt, her baby wrapped close to her blouse, gold hoop earrings, and sandals. Their physical depictions, clothing, and belongings racially marked them as fleeing from elsewhere, visibly in transit. The young man asked me, who I'm not sure if he was half joking or half serious, knowing that my book had recently come out about the region. He asked me, "Did you put that sign there?" Residents along this border have long expressed sympathy for migrants in transit, who in turn rely on residents' social connections, border knowledge, as well as the cover and protection that this clandestine road provides from state authorities and dangerous actors. Many border inhabitants have been in the United States or they had family there. Yet their empathies were straining, especially over the past decade, as intensifying immigrant enforcement and the rising costs and perils of the journey had led more migrants to prolong their stays in Mexico as well as in their communities, sometimes indefinitely. In 2007, one of the Mexican border communities even tried to expel the Central Americans living there, but was ultimately unsuccessful. Other studies depict the challenges as well as solidarities that Central American migrants forge and face along their increasingly fragmented northward journeys, as well as interactions with communities they transit. But there's often less attention to the wider social dynamics of transit corridors beyond the way they impact migrants. I focus on this one transit corridor to argue that transit spaces and representations of migrants in transit are conceptually constituted, articulated through, and uphold racial projects of exclusionary nationalism. Transit spaces are not neutral, nor ones that can simply be reduced to their instrumental functions in the migratory process. Instead, I show how they racially and hierarchically organize space, access, and belonging within what Malki calls the national order of things, or the naturalization of a world based on a neat division of sovereign states where people are assumed to belong. By conflating nationality, belonging, territoriality, and identity, the national order of things presumes mobility and displacement to be aberrant, in need of a spatial fix, often executed by national xenophobic states. The concepts of transit, refugee, migrant, and resident are thus informed by, but also shore up the racial foundations of the Mexican and Guatemalan states. In this framing, selective concern for the plight of refugees who perform particular stereotypes of victimhood or extraordinary deservingness exists in inherent tension with the inverse trope of the menacing racialized threat of the migrant. This young man pointed to the UNHCR poster. He was at once interested about and expressed sympathy for migrants, but he was also suspicious about who was benefiting from these kind of programs targeted at migrants. Both postures are animated by racist stereotypes and enable selective benevolence, while also maintaining the racial fiction of stable nation states and securitized border policies that repel the majority of unwanted others. By racially distancing themselves from, casting suspicion upon, but also selectively offering assistance and care to migrants, residents there attempt to smooth the instability evoked by transit, to firmly place themselves within their nation states, despite their own actually more fluid forms of belonging and experiences. Ethnographies of transit point to the constellation of actors, social worlds, infrastructures, and encounters that make up the transit space. But they're also often still very migrant-centric. Scholars have troubled the concept of transit as a neutral middle or linking space to examine migrant mobilities and immobilities. Still, transit spaces are largely defined in relation to the places they connect, made socially meaningful through material traces, footsteps, infrastructures, and the encounters left by those who use it, or migrants who transit them. The concept of transit, I show also in many ways inheres in thinking like a state. The spatial and analytical concept of transit therefore reinforces the national order of things by construing transit spaces as temporary, unstable, even non-places, made meaningful by the steps of those on their way from one place to another, which are assumed to be stable nation states. Migrants also do not enter neutral terrain, but tread onto geographies already saturated by colonial and racialized dynamics of power. By attuning to the racial and colonial dynamics in which they enter, decolonial studies highlight how migration is constituted in relation to race and nation in ways that uphold these very fictions. The concept, for example, of the colonial immigrant points to how certain migrant groups are racialized in similar ways to what Grossfogel calls colonial or racial subjects of empire, who experience subordination in the nation state despite having citizenship. In Mexico, the National Project of Mestizaje erased indigenous peoples through assimilation, especially in this border region, where ethnic affinities with Guatemala often raised the specter of anti-nationalism, leading to intense Mexicanization campaigns in the early 20th century. This terrain influenced later suspicions, especially of Guatemalan indigenous refugees who entered the region fleeing the conflict in the 80s as threatening and out of place. And this, many cases, transformed the ethnic makeup of this region again. Guatemala's racial hierarchy, in contrast, is informed by a more static Ladino-Indio divide that continues to denigrate indigenous peoples, facilitated genocide, and in many ways also fosters zero-sum fears among non-indigenous Latinos. Migrants experience racialization along these hierarchies. Specifically, Mexico has long constituted the border or transit space via deliberate racialized contrast with an indigenous Guatemala to mark it by what it is not. The racialization of migrant transit interacts with these regional racial politics to inform local views towards migrants, both towards the indigenous Guatemalan refugees who fled to the region in the 80s, as well as more recently with Hondurans and Salvadorans. In both periods, social, economic, and political anxieties were deflected onto the bodies of racialized others in transit, but especially when they prolonged their stays. In the 80s, the border was racialized as Guatemalan refugees shed their indigenous clothing and language to avoid deportation, where they were marked by their indigenous identity, before Mexico established refugee processing camps. Even after, their indigenous identity continued to mark them as other in this Mexicanized border region, including fears that there would be social and political contagion of insurgency in Chiapas. These fears led the government in Mexico to attempt to relocate and contain refugees to the Yucatan. To this day, former Guatemalan refugees, many of whom actually naturalized in Mexico in the late 90s, still experience subordination as colonial immigrants, still perceived as other, often called new Mexicans, still Guatemalans or refugees, despite the fact they have citizenship. They're also more likely to lack land and basic services. And in fact, many Mexican residents told me there are no indigenous peoples here. The indigenous peoples you see here, they're really Guatemalan. In recent years, racialized fears of Central Americans have drawn on mediatized images of gang violence to profile young Central American men, transposing the view that, as residents say, they come from conflicted countries onto fears that these young men are naturally violent. They're racialized by distinct hair color and style, clothing, occasionally tattoos, the way they speak, and that they don't carry anything. In contrast to, they point to Guatemalans who they'll argue, well, they carry backpacks, which signals that they're just there to work and return home. And this really draws on the use of Guatemalan labor as seasonal and day labor in the region. Border residents therefore largely treat Guatemalans as their paisanos, even their fellow countrymen, with whom they've long shared social and kinship networks, as well as these day labor arrangements and seasonal work that Guatemalans have engaged in Chiapas for generations. And in contrast to the Hondurans and Salvadorans, Guatemalans were not seen as likely to stay. When migrants were in transit or temporary, this solidarity was more likely. As one woman explained to me, "It hurts me to see their suffering. I think of my children in the US. We provide migrants with food, shelter, water, but thank God they do not remain." Like the contagion that residents feared indigenous refugees would bring into Chiapas in the 80s, recent views of Central American violence is viewed within a similar fear of spillover. Meanwhile, the wider criminalization of mobility shifts the specter of criminality onto the very migrants attempting to flee and navigate it. Historically, migrants, refugees, and indigenous peoples in this region have stood in for anxieties from wider sources of insecurity and inequality in marginalized borderlands that are nonetheless crucial sites from where the state reaffirms and naturalizes its racial dynamics of power and the fiction of territorial integrity. The migrant, refugee, and indigenous other are critical to defining the boundaries of the ethno-racial state by what it is not, according to who resides outside of it. More recent migrant flows tread onto these spaces marked by colonial and racial dynamics of power. Border residents are more likely to tolerate migrants as long as they are temporarily in transit versus prolonged. Yet rather than parse out the conditions under whether inhabitants accept migrants or not, I really focus on interrogating such racialized dynamics of selective compassion and suspicion within the lens of transit itself in the context of the region's racial politics and history. To do so means going beyond a migrant-centric view of transit spaces that sanitizes the concept of transit from its political and racial underpinnings. To be in transit or transit spaces signifies such states in many ways as outside these sites is outside sustained concern. They are temporary non-places, to be considered largely as a function in relation to the places they stitch together. The creation of transit as an empty middle space is infused by the national order of things, by what is imagined to exist on the other side. Stable nation states where people naturally belong, can be sent back to, come from, or go to. Transit thus actually settles the unruly assumptions often attributed to mobility by temporally and spatially cordoning it off. Mobility in transit can be strewed as temporary aberrations, in contrast to a stasis that threatens to contaminate the racial order, national order of things. The conceptual treatment of transit as non or linking spaces also helps us understand the states of exception carved from within them and how they become necropolitical spaces where violence and premature exposure to death often thrive. For example, states deliberately manipulate transit designations to absolve their responsibilities for asylum seekers, whether they offer those responsibilities to transit countries or even excise portions of their own territory to relabel them as transit zones where fewer rights apply. Transit is thus part of a more expansive carceral and conceptual architecture of containment that includes deportation to violently force people back into place, detention that immobilizes migrants out of sight, as well as immobilizing processing, as well as offshoring processing to transitory waypoints. Finally, returning to the UNHCR poster, it depicts the man, woman, and the infant in motion, signaling they are in transit. The term migrant invokes a figure still on the move, who moves from one place to another, but does not yet and may never arrive or belong. Critically exploring the concept and wider social dynamics and racial politics of transit highlights how transit naturalizes a hierarchy of constrained compassion to those assumed to be moving on to elsewhere, enabling empathy to be extended in limited form versus those who may linger or remain. Far from a neutral middle space, transit is a racial space that helps hierarchically and morally sort and organize the geography of migration, deservingness, and belonging. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Galemba. That's right on time. And
Great.
you've definitely deepened our understanding and our interrogation of transit as space, something that I'm sure will carry over into the other presentations and the discussion. The second presentation will be done, we'll have double the pleasure, Juanita Cabrera Lopez, Maya Mam, and also Emil Keme. Together, they will be presenting Chorti, Maya Resistance, Forced Internal Migration, and Settler Colonial Borders in Central America. Juanita Cabrera Lopez is a Maya Mam and originally from the Western Highlands of Guatemala. She's the executive director of the International Mayan League in Washington, D.C. She is a survivor of the internal armed conflict in Guatemala and a former political refugee, and has both personal and professional work experience in the defense of Indigenous peoples' human rights. Her focus has been to use international law and organizations and traditional knowledge for the development of an Indigenous human rights response in the areas of immigration, land rights, and environmental protection. She works with Maya leaders and elders in Guatemala and the United States through their traditional institutions. She holds a Master of International Public Policy from Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. Emil Keme is an Indigenous Quiche Maya scholar, member of the Maya anti-colonial collective Ishbabalan Kai. No, let me start this again. And he actually taught me this morning how to say it more or less. Ishbalan Ke Hunapo Wunak, and an associate professor at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. His teaching and research focus on contemporary Latin American literatures and cultural studies, with particular emphasis on Indigenous literatures and social movements, Central American literatures and cultures, and post-colonial and subaltern studies theory. He is the author of Maya Nationalisms and Post-Colonial Challenges in Guatemala, which also has a Spanish version published earlier, and is the 2020 recipient of Cuba's prestigious Casa de las Americas literary criticism for his book, Our Maya Word, Poetics of Resistance in Guatemala, the Spanish version of which was also published by Casa de las Americas itself. Thank you for coming to us today, both of you, and go ahead, you have the floor.
Good afternoon, good morning to everyone. I would like to first acknowledge that I am speaking from the ancestral territories of the Innu and Occaneechi peoples, present-day Chapel Hill. And as a Quiche Maya immigrant, I'm very grateful to the generations of peoples that have taken care of this land for thousands of years. I would also like to thank the organizers of this event for their kind invitation and for creating this space to have this conversation. And yes, the way we're going to proceed with Juanita is that I'm going to be talking about the social and historical context in Chorti Maya lands, and then she's going to be discussing some of the root causes of internal migration in Central America. So For those of you who are not familiar with the Chorti Maya people, they represent one of 31 indigenous Maya nations in Mesoamerica. And their ancestral territory is located in present-day El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. And their experience is an exceptional one because they have been crossed by 3 settler colonial borders. And their colonized condition offers an important diagnosis about indigenous settler colonial state relations. Historically, I'm gonna stop sharing, and I'm gonna come back again to this. Historically and today, as you know, indigenous people's relations with the state has been marked by important tensions since modern national states in the Americas see us as a problem, right? We are a problem because we speak different languages, because we look differently, because we have, because we dress differently, but most importantly, we represent a problem because we live in territories that are rich in natural goods, right? And the Chorti Maya people perfectly exemplify what Patrick Wolf defines as settler colonialism and the logic of elimination. That is, settlers want access to the land occupied by indigenous peoples to exploit it. And to do so, the native that occupies the land must be eliminated or assimilated into the colonial structure. The Chorti Maya have suffered some of the worst attacks to their existence by colonial governments. In El Salvador, for example, and I'm going to be going back to sharing my presentation. In El Salvador, for example, you know, we talk about, we remember La Matanza, right? It was a massacre in which the government assassinated over 30,000 people at the hands of Salvadorian soldiers for protesting the government and the oppressive policies of President Maximiliano Hernandez Martinez. Given that the price of coffee had dropped, landowners invaded and dispossessed indigenous peoples of their lands to make up for lost profits. Not only that, the government also reduced campesino or peasants' wages, leading to protests that were met with violence. This violence specifically targeted indigenous peoples and even led many of them to suppress their identity, since it meant a matter of survival. It was in 1959 when we see indigenous resurgence in El Salvador, and some sectors would organize, and led by Nahuatl people labor leader Adrián Esquino Lisco, created the National Association of Salvadorian Indigenous Peoples, or ANIS, to fight for the rights. And despite the many challenges and limitations, their organization continues to struggle for indigenous rights in El Salvador, and now in the United States. They created an organization that operates from Washington, D.C. I will also recommend, if you're interested in learning more about El Salvador from a scientific perspective, we recommend the upcoming book by Dr. Jessica Hernandez, Fresh Banana Leaves. Jessica Hernandez is Maya, Chorti, and Zapotec, and she offers a really fascinating perspective addressing climate change in Central America. It's a great book, we highly recommend it. And she's a volunteer for the International Mayan League. So, similar to what happened in El Salvador, in Guatemala, we experienced a 36-year armed conflict. And particularly in the years 1978 and 1984, the Guatemalan state turned terrorist in the sense that they developed military strategies to eliminate indigenous peoples with the excuse that they were at war, right? And so they developed the strategy of quitarle el agua al pez, to take away the water from the fish. A metaphor in which the fish was represented by the guerrilla movement and the water by the supporters of the guerrilla movement. And it was then that the government just interfered in a lot of indigenous territories and killed thousands of peoples. And this is important to mention too, that it was a very complex process in which another way that the Guatemalan government decided to take away land from people was pushing people in the Chorti Maya lands to join the Guatemalan army, right? And it was a way to take away their lands. Okay, let me. And it is no excuse too, like to see what's going on in Guatemala, because the people that suffer this colonial violence, it is in their ancestral territories where we see mining companies as well as hydroelectric dams being built. So it was, an orchestrated attack in order to eliminate people from those territories to extract natural goods, right? And so in Honduras, we see the emergence of El Consejo Nacional Indígena Maya Chortí, the Indigenous National Council of the Chortí Maya peoples in Honduras. In 1988, 45 families from the village of Chonco took over 56 hectares of land from non-Indigenous landowners, and the government responded to that by sending the military. They killed people and incarcerated a lot of the leaders. And this, however, motivated a lot of communities to join forces and demand that the government free the prisoners as well as to give the land back to the indigenous peoples. And this resulted in a lawsuit between the National Agrarian Institute and the landowners, resulting in 42 hectares of land that was returned to indigenous families. And this will eventually lead to the creation of the Consejo Nacional Indígena in 1994. And this is a great organization that has done so much to revitalize Chortí Maya culture, language, and history. They teach courses in Chortí Maya language. They support artesanos or people that make stuff with their hands, like weavings or ceramics. And they also are able to retell the history of their peoples from their own perspectives. They use tourism to perform some of their stories, like they play the Maya ball game, they tell stories from the Popol Vuh, and one interesting story that they tell is the story of Kinich Yash Kukmo, or the Radiant First Quetzal Mako, the founder of the city of Copan, the ancestral city of Copan. And it's the way they portrayed him as a revolutionary is just fascinating. And so what we can tell from the colonial violence perpetrated by this colonial state is that the main source of conflict between the Chortí people and the state is land and the use of its natural goods. Such violence is ongoing, and it has been aggravated by a number of factors. One, the neoliberal capitalist extractivist policies, the presence of both Protestant and Christian church. It is curious to see how after these colonial attacks, what the other actors that immediately appear in those areas that have been affected by that colonial violence is the church, both the Protestant and Christian church. It has infiltrated all of these ancestral territories in order to help the people, right? And the other major factor that has been contributing to a lot of forced migration aside from the violence is climate change. And we like the Chortí Maya people are dealing with climate change manifested in long droughts or at times heavy rains that have destroyed their harvest. People don't know when it is a good time to plant, given the unexpectability of the weather. And this is also not to say that the Chortí Maya peoples have been the mere victims of the violence perpetrated by the state and its colonial institutions. They have also been able to creatively use these institutions to assert their agency and their own political interest. They have appropriated the dominant institutions to advance their own needs, as we can see with the Indigenous National Council in Honduras. And recently, the other Chortí Maya organization, the Coordinadora de Asociaciones o Comunidades para el Desarrollo Integral del Pueblo Chortí, or Communities for Integral Development for the Chortí region in Guatemala, who recently won a lawsuit that they brought against the government. And Juanita is going to be talking a little more about that. And now I give the word to Juanita.
Juanita. Greetings, my name is Juanita, and I am here in Piscataway Nation territory. It is an honor and pleasure for me to be here. Before I enter into our slides, I want to give space to our partners from Komundich, and they will have a testimony that they want to share for a couple of minutes of how migration is impacting them in their territory. Emil?
Ambos, yo soy Rodimiro Lantán, Soy una autoridad xinca del pueblo xinca. He estado con el pueblo chortí acompañándolos durante su lucha por sus derechos, la defensa de sus territorios, su identidad, ya por un tiempo de 20 años. Actualmente soy el coordinador general de Comundich. Los desplazamientos son multitudinarios, ya hay caravanas de 5 o 7 mil personas, y eso no es natural, ¿verdad? No era muy normal dentro de el contexto de la migración alrededor de ahí de hace unos 3, 4 años atrás. El proceso de la migración ha tenido su epicentro dentro del territorio chortí, precisamente por el tema de su ubicación fronteriza, ¿verdad? Ahora, ¿cómo nos afecta? Es que nos afecta porque, como lo decimos, el epicentro de la confrontación es dentro de los territorios chortís, ¿verdad? Y la otra es que históricamente los chortís viven violencia, siguen viviendo una constante violencia, y eso pues también golpea mucho el estado psicológico de las comunidades. Pero no solo es el hecho de que se confronte también a las caravanas de migrantes, sino es que la migración generalmente no regresa hasta donde debería de ser, que es a los hogares, a sus casas. Muchas personas salen con lo único que tienen y regresar no es opción, ¿verdad? La vida es tan complicada y la aspiración única, digamos, que tienen es: yo mejor quiero migrar, yo mejor me quiero ir de aquí, porque mi situación es bien complicada, no tengo medios para vivir, no tengo medios para producir. ¿Qué otro camino tengo nada más que emigrar?
So and if we can go to the next slide, please, Emil. So as he was mentioning, in terms of the nature of human mobility at this moment has gone from small family units to large-scale human mobility of thousands of peoples, really to have the protective mechanisms within migration in such a large scale. But two particular impacts that it has had in the epicenter of this, which is in the Maya Chortí territory, because of the nexus of imposed colonial borders that are now El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala, have been that, one, as has already been mentioned, many of the people do not end up making it to the next border, which is Mexico and Guatemala. So they end up staying in the Maya Chortí territory, which is an already impoverished territory that has multiple pressures on the communities. And then they are now stepping up because the state has left that territory to fend for itself. And the second is a remilitarization of those borders, because the borders between Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras are a border in which the United States is very interested to stop further migration north. And so this means that in a context that has already suffered from 36 years of civil war, of genocide, of forced military labor, now there's a remilitarization of those borders and conflicts that adds additional psychological, as was stated, psychological trauma to the communities, in addition to the pressures of the communities. And then, as has already been mentioned, really looking at the geographic location of Guatemala as being in the top 5 countries in Latin America that are at high risk for climate change. And so looking at the dry corridor now with ETA and IOTA affecting also the stability of the communities has led to more factors in which those are root drivers of forced migration. If we can go to the next slide, please. And so really, as Emil has already mentioned previously, for Indigenous peoples, our rights to our lands and territories, and the fact that we have been living in dispossession for more than 500 years because of the imposition of colonial states and colonial legacies rooted in racism, discrimination, and inequality that are structural. What the Maya Chortí people have been doing to make sure that their communities are not forced out, and also to protect their lands and territories from forced development, has been working on regaining the certainty, the legal certainty in a collective manner over their lands and territories. One of the interesting cases with the Maya Chorti people is that they actually have collective land titles that are recognized when Guatemala was being created. It was recognized by the colonial states. And so it's actually also land titles that show that the imposition of what is now El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala, that those colonial borders were created, superimposed on indigenous peoples' territories, violating a consultation and a consent process from the communities, because they never consented to those colonial borders that are now imposed on them. Within the reclaiming ancestral lands process, it's also a resurgence of what Emil has already stated, autonomous indigenous structural process, self-governance, self-determination through our ancestral processes of governance. If we can go to the next slide, please. But what that has also implicated, and also continues to be another root driver of forced migration, is that when our people stand up and defend our lands and our territories, our human rights and the rights of Mother Earth, our people are persecuted, we're criminalized, and in the most extreme situations, our leaders are assassinated. In the case with the Maya Chorti people, in 2018, 6 people were criminalized for defending their lands and territories. But this is not something that's in the past. In September of this year, 5 additional people were criminalized and currently under house arrest because they have been fighting against a mining company. And one of the people that was persecuted and is under house arrest was separated from her baby who was still breastfeeding. And so this also looks at the gendered impacts of criminalization, persecution, and how it impacts communities, families, and the large-scale intimidation for our leaders to stop defending our lands and our territories. And so we do, bring call to action on also that as we look at the root drivers of forced migration, we have to look at the political context and the complicity of governments in the continuation of human rights violations over our peoples and a disproportionate impact, particularly for Indigenous peoples and communities. If we can go to the next slide, please. And really, I just want to close out the the presentation by talking about some of the key strategies that Indigenous peoples are using in the defense of their autonomy, their sovereignty, their land rights, and self-determination. And really, the first one that we've already talked about is reclaiming our lands. And so if we have access to legal certainty over our lands and territories, which has been acknowledged as a key strategy for climate change mitigation, for creating stability around agricultural systems, production systems, it really goes back to being able to have access and rights over our lands. The next point is the resurgence of our Indigenous identity, spirituality, language, and historical knowledge, which is closely tied to our rights to our ancestral lands, because we are an expression and rooted in our lands. The next one is reinforcing Indigenous leadership, meaning our traditional government structures, our councils, our authorities, and really acknowledging that Indigenous peoples have traditional government systems that should be recognized as part of the political structure of any of these entities that are colonial states superimposed over Indigenous lands and territories. And then the last point is really, as we reclaim and have resurgence of our cultures, we're also restoring ancestral knowledge, traditional knowledge systems, which also goes back to adaptation and mitigation around climate change. And so really just reinforcing again, the connection with lands and territories as a key piece of looking at addressing forced migration, forced mobility, and really creating stability in the region by bringing power back to communities that have been segregated and marginalized by the state. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Emil and Juanita, for pointing to the centrality always of land in these questions, and also for bringing forward ideas and aims and strategies of Indigenous communities themselves with respect to their self-determination, and of course that conjunction between injustice, climate change, and land. Thank you very much. We're going to the third presentation next, which is Kristin Collins, who will present Theorizing Contemporary Mesoamerica for Decolonial Migration Studies. Dr. Kolenz is the Sawyer Seminar Postdoctoral Research Associate in Brown Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies. She earned her doctorate in Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at The Ohio State University. She's currently working on her book manuscript, which analyzes the transnational movements and community building practices of Central Americans subjected to forced migration, dangerous crossing conditions, incarceration, and confinement. In the study, Kristen takes an interdisciplinary approach that combines ethnographic methods, her own activist practice, and performance studies to document the transformative possibilities that emerge from Central America's everyday practices, or Central Americans' everyday practices of coping with loss, distance, and violence, to theorize transnational belongings in resistance to white supremacy. Dr. Collins.
Thanks so much to Geri for moderating, and also to my co-panelists who have really set the floor excellently for what I'm about to share. And also thanks to everyone who's here accompanying us. And lastly, to the amazing team at CLACS who has been collaborating with me for months to make this all work. And I'm really proud of the work that we've done and the relationship that we've built. So I'm gonna go ahead and jump in. So what I have to share today is a small piece of the book project. In the book, I'm concerned with racialized state violence, necropolitical governance, and the weaponization of linear time, and the ways that those things separate communities. And the project situates activism as a text, as a lens through which to engage theories of colonial violence, and also as a site from which transformation emerges. And so today I'm going to demonstrate this final piece, reading embodied activist action as theory of decolonizing transformation. And so because the project deals with separations engineered by the state, I'm interested in using tools that shed critical light on the processes that generate distance between groups who might otherwise bring their power together. Performance studies scholar Diana Taylor brings into focus a particular separation, a colonial binary, the archive versus the repertoire. For Taylor, the archive refers to the written, the documentable, the legitimized, the enduring, the supposedly timeless knowledge that is institutionalized and underlies the dominating narratives of our reality. But knowledge is produced and transmitted in ways that far exceed writing. Taylor says that we transform Latin American studies away from coloniality when we look for and theorize with knowledge that is both written, unwritten, and unwritable. She suggests we turn to the repertoire or traditions of embodied practice. And so before I turn to the repertoire, I'll dwell just for a minute in the archive. And so this map is an emblematic example of the archive. Any map is an emblematic example. It's a two-dimensional drawing of the colonizer's story of the world. The map endures because it can be published, copied, uploaded, downloaded, or pasted onto my PowerPoint presentation. These lines we see illustrate divisions that are based on the most opportune truths for those with economic and political power. But Taylor says, when we are critical of archival knowledge and privileged ways of knowing that have been marginalized, we're in a position to remap the Americas. We can draw new lines, think in terms of new dimensions, learn new stories about the lives lived on the lands, and imagine alternative possibilities for the lives that could be lived here. So accepting this invitation to remap the Americas through the repertoire, to follow these traditions of embodied knowledge, I offer a critical exploration of what I call contemporary Mesoamerica. So to begin, why does Mesoamerica need to be remapped, and why do I use contemporary as a modifier? The label Mesoamerica can be traced back to Paul Kirchhoff, a German anthropologist who coined the term in 1943 to refer to the region that spanned from northern Mexico to Costa Rica at the time of conquest. Since then, the exact contours of the region have shifted, but the most common usage in the US Academy has continued to refer to pre-conquest time and pre-conquest people. I'm troubled by this usage of Mesoamerica, by the implication that at the point of conquest, these peoples and knowledges abruptly cease to exist. I'm worried that Mesoamerica as a distinctly pre-colonial place reinforces the colonial logic that colonizers completely disappeared indigenous peoples, that these vibrant indigenous communities that we've heard so eloquently about from Juanita and Emil, that these communities no longer exist on the land. It's clearly not true. Because genocide is ongoing, in the form of overt violence, mining, mega projects, forced migration, and many more subtle ways, I insist that Kirchhoff's Mesoamerica and its discursive violence requires urgent remapping. So I want to remap Mesoamerica and not just throw it out, because I see that Kirchhoff's thinking offers us something. It allows us to see a region undivided by nation-state borders. Visualizing this region as Mesoamerica remembers the possibility of divisions other than those that today overdetermine who people are and where they belong. Of course, for Kirchhoff, nation-state borders had not yet existed. So his map doesn't exactly present the radical challenge to geopolitical divides that I would like to propose. But this leads me to the idea of a contemporary Mesoamerica. So we use the modifier contemporary to distinguish this geography from its archaeological usage, but I still call to mind the region's continuity, and I also call to mind its location in the middle of the Americas. This middleness is essential now as the region sustains transit for people in motion from more and more sites of origin around the world, and for those forcefully returned from the north. The meso, the prefix, emphasizes this as a transit region, an in-between place for those who go back and forth, whether on their journey north, whether they're moving east or west, or whether they're coming back from a former home as a result of forced removal. So when I remap Kirchhoff's Mesoamerica and refigure it as contemporary Mesoamerica, I maintain its radical continuity, its place in between, and I dissolve the temporal border that provoked my remapping in the first place. And this dissolution of the temporal border lays the groundwork for transtemporal social relationships, which I won't talk about today, but is a coalition building strategy that I examine in the book project. So the embodied practice that informs my remapping is the political advocacy and community accompanying work of the Movimiento Migrante Mesoamericano, or the Mesoamerican migrant movement. Today I'll refer to them as the Movimiento. The Movimiento arose in the mid-2000s as a response to increasing movement and escalating violence on Mexican and Central American migrant transit routes. Beginning as voluntarily and forcefully returned Mexican migrants, this group has now evolved in their membership and become a recognized political force that continues to intervene in national and international policy toward migration reform in the United States, Mexico, and Central America. The Movimiento organizes around the collective concerns of Mexicans and Central Americans transit, as well as those in the US diaspora and those who return to their places of origin, whether by force or voluntarily. Calling themselves Mesoamerican, this collective situates their continuous geography at the center of their work. They root their connection in a common region and in common struggles, goals, and insights about mobility toward and away from the United States. So without dissolving any local specificities, the Movimiento suspends the primacy of national identity to focus on the transit and diasporic experiences of people and communities from the Northern Triangle, from Mexico, and from what was once Mexico in the US Southwest. The Movimiento mobilizes from a contemporary place called Mesoamerica and develops an ethic of connectedness to the land and belonging to a community sensitive to the dangers of borders and engineering outcasts. And this engineering of outcasts is what Rebecca was talking about in her talk. And so building on their mobilization through Mesoamericanness, I propose contemporary Mesoamerica, which encapsulates Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala, Mexico, and the US Southwest, as a heuristic device for analyzing decolonial resistance in the region. The movimiento recognizes the shared deep colonial history of this region, which Juanita talked about, and also the ways that contemporary Mesoamerican localities are similarly affected by economic policies that serve elite and global northern interests, and forced migration and all of the accompanying border enforcement policies. Even as political and legal rhetoric around migration reinforces nationality distinctions, these countries experience increasingly interconnected struggles. And so in the interest of time, I'm going to skip a little bit. So I want to kind of move toward conclusion by talking a little bit about the spiritual geography of Mesoamerica. So inspired by the Movimiento's work that doesn't just cross borders, but imagines a world in which those borders do not exist or do not divide, I propose that contemporary Mesoamerica need not only refer to a physical space, but also to a spiritual geography. And I see this as a spiritual geography that offers a theory of radically inclusive belonging that is inspired by the land, but not necessarily tied to the physical place. So much like Gloria Anzaldua's Chicana lesbian revision of Aztlán, the homeland of the pre-Columbian Aztecs and their descendants. So Anzaldúa says that the physical territory founds a transcendent ethic of belonging and a practice of hospitality. She claims Aztlán for the outcasts and the borderlands dwellers, and she names and refuses the colonial and nationalist, whether Chicano or white, entitlements to the land. Through her non-belonging as queer, as dark-skinned, as Chicana, Anzaldúa binds herself to the other outsiders. She envisions Aztlán as more than just a homeland for herself, but for anyone marginalized by colonialism. And not only is this a place to be, but it's a blueprint for making home on any kind of land according to this theory of belonging. And so contemporary Mesoamerica, I'm moving toward the end, breaks down nation state divisions and temporal conditions. And I just want to conclude by also gesturing to earlier work of Emil Keme, who talks about Abya as an alternative to the coloniality of the term America or Americas. And so I recognize that Mesoamerica reproduces this coloniality. But I just want to say that I want to pick up on Emil's work and the ways that he suggests that we work with these terms, sort of recognizing their imperfection, but also the ways that they can work together to move toward colonizing, but as long as we sort of move through them differentially. And so here I'm picking up on the work of Chela Sandoval, who encourages us to use a differential consciousness or a kinetic way of thinking, which I propose is a very opportune and useful way to think about migration studies. So, thank you.
Thanks very much, Kristen, for pointing us to the dangers of mapping and naming practices and the possibilities of reconceptualizing them or even collapsing or re-indigenizing them. It's very important. Our fourth presentation, and we're very much on time, this is good, is Dunia Araceli Montoya Medina, who will present I've got to read this in Spanish, oh dear, forgive me. Una perspectiva sobre la migración centroamericana desde el periodismo y la defensa de los derechos humanos. Dunia Montoya Medina earned her undergraduate degree from the Centro Universitario Regional del Norte and is now working toward her master's degree in communication at the Universidad del Valle de Sula in San Pedro Sula, Honduras. As a professional journalist and defender of human rights, she has worked with women's organizations to promote Maquila workers' rights. This work began in 1996 with the workers' radio program Los Golondrinas. In 1999, Dunia began producing another radio program, Sin Fronteras, to raise awareness of problems around migration, and this led to the formation of the Comité de Familiares de Migrants de El Progreso. Now, as the director of the Association Comunicación Comunitaria, she has published 50 editions of their Revista Vida Laboral. Together with her life partner, Bartolo Fuentes, Dunia also accompanies, reports on, and provides human rights support to migrants who participated in the 2018 caravan from Honduras. Dunia, por favor. Unmute. Unmute yourself. Unmute. There should be something at the bottom left. At the bottom of your screen, at the left should be mute. Unmute.
Muy bien. Pues sí, muchas gracias. Bueno, gracias por esta oportunidad, ¿verdad? Por compartir con ustedes la experiencia que hemos tenido en Honduras a partir del campo de la comunicación y la defensa de los derechos humanos. Quiero comenzar situando el país para poder entender la realidad de por qué el comportamiento del alto flujo migratorio que se ha sucedido en los últimos años y que ha convertido a Honduras en uno de los focos de atención estos últimos periodos. Decir que Honduras es un país empobrecido, ¿verdad? Por una aborazada élite política y empresarial que ha dilapidado los recursos del Estado, convirtiéndolo en el país con mayor desigualdad a nivel de Latinoamérica. Los informes del Consejo Nacional de Corrupción, un organismo nacional, estiman que cada año se pierden más de $2 millones producto de la corrupción en el país. A esto hay que sumarle los 12 años de conflictos políticos y sociales que se ha vivido en el país después del golpe de Estado, el fraude electoral del 2017, el incremento de la violencia, los secuestros, extorsiones que hacen perder cientos de miles de dólares, el despojo de los territorios y los bienes naturales, el control de las estructuras del Estado por parte del crimen organizado y el narcotráfico. Para nadie es desconocido que el hermano del presidente hondureño está en las cárceles de Estados Unidos acusado de exportar toneladas de droga para ese país. Y para rematar, la crisis de la pandemia, que aunque la hemos vivido todos en el mundo, ¿verdad? Eso ha afectado fuertemente al país. Y las embestidas de los 2 fenómenos naturales del año pasado, 2 huracanes que han provocado mayor pobreza, desesperanza en la población. Por eso les decía, entender esta realidad de Honduras es clave para explicarse por qué del alto flujo migratorio en los últimos años. Las remesas en Honduras son el pilar fundamental para el sostenimiento de este país. Las autoridades proyectan que para el cierre de este año sumarán un total equivalente a $7,000 millones. Con eso se sostiene Honduras. Honduras antes del 2018 vivía un éxodo de goteo, es decir, salían casi a diario y a escondidas. En las penumbras de las noches, cientos de hondureños abordaban el transporte que los conduciría hasta la frontera con Guatemala, dispuestos a recorrer los más de 3,000 kilómetros hacia Estados Unidos. Algunos en pocas cantidades, sacrificando los bienes de su familia en Honduras, endeudando a los parientes que radican en Estados Unidos con montos de hasta $15,000 para pagarle a los coyotes, que son las personas que se dedican al tráfico de personas. Otro menor cantidad, pues, se lanzan a la suerte, desafiando la muerte, la violencia, la extorsión o cualquier tipo de amenaza que ocurre en la ruta migratoria. Como periodistas y defensores de derechos humanos, nos ha tocado conocer cientos de casos de personas que han retornado al país con historias trágicas, mutilaciones, traumas que les han dejado huellas de por vida. Hemos ayudado a repatriar cuerpos de quienes murieron en el camino por accidentes, ataques de delincuentes. Hemos conocido cientos de casos de víctimas de extorsiones, secuestros, personas raptadas por la prostitución o para integrarlos a las bandas criminales. También de migrantes que están en las cárceles de otros países porque no han tenido la defensa adecuada. El año 1999 iniciamos un esfuerzo de juntar a las madres y los parientes de migrantes desaparecidos, precisamente aquí en la ciudad donde nosotros vivimos, en el norte de Honduras, en El Progreso. Esa era una realidad totalmente desconocida en el país, ¿no? Solo lo enfrentaban sus familias solas, lo vivían solas, y se organizó un programa de radio en la emisora Radio Progreso, una emisora de la Compañía de Jesús, de los jesuitas en Honduras. A partir de eso, las madres empezaron a tener voz y contar al mundo esa realidad de sus hijos migrantes desaparecidos. Así nació el Comité de Familiares de Migrantes Desaparecidos de Honduras, COFAMIPRO. En diciembre del 2000, en el diciembre del año 2000, realizamos la primera caravana de búsqueda de migrantes desaparecidos. Fuimos a Tecumumán, a la casa de migrantes, conocimos los sitios, las rutas donde los migrantes salían. Pudimos entrar en una primera peregrinación hacia México, a la ciudad de Hidalgo, precisamente en los momentos en que celebraba el Día de la Guadalupana en México. Pudimos entrar y así se inició un proceso de búsqueda que permitió que COFAMIPRO se constituyera, se fortaleciera y todavía siga existiendo. Esta iniciativa del Comité de Familiares de Migrantes de Madres de Desaparecidos permitió la posibilidad que otros comités en Honduras se constituyeran y en el área centroamericana. Estos comités ya por su cuenta y con apoyo de organizaciones en México ya llevan más de 14 caravanas de madres que han logrado entrar a México, generar mayor sensibilidad en el área centroamericana y mexicana, y muchos de sus parientes también hayan sido finalmente encontrados. En los registros físicos de COFAMIPRO se contabiliza más de 600 casos de desaparecidos, pero de forma moderada podemos estimar que la cifra puede rondar hasta 3.000 personas desaparecidas de Honduras en el tránsito migratorio. Convencidos precisamente de la ausencia de protección y de esta situación que enfrentan los migrantes, de la falta de información con la que ellos viajan, hombres, mujeres, y hace un par de años familias completas que se ven forzados por las circunstancias que hemos mencionado, deciden aventurarse a realizar esta dura travesía. Tomamos entonces la decisión de recabar más información, conocer de más cerca los riesgos que enfrentan los migrantes. En marzo del 2018 partió una caravana de migrantes desde Tapachula hasta Tijuana. A finales del mes de abril llegó a Tijuana del 2018. El llamado Vía Crucis, como se le ha llamado, aglutinó en algún momento unas 2.000 personas, un 90% integrada por hondureños y hondureñas. La caravana se disolvió porque el gobierno mexicano les otorgó algunos salvoconductos y esto permitió que por 30 días pudieran movilizarse en ese país y los que tenían recursos pues tomar transporte seguro, sin riesgo de deportaciones e irse. Mi compañero de vida, de trabajo, Bartolo Fuentes, se sumó a la cobertura periodística de esta caravana cuando llegaron a la capital mexicana. Ahí los migrantes con menos recursos pues acudieron también a las embajadas hondureñas a pedir información, a pedir acompañamiento, sin embargo no fueron atendidos. Es a partir de ahí que se continúa una cobertura periodística mucho más intensa, ¿verdad? Y que fue seguida por cientos y miles de hondureños por las transmisiones en vivo en Facebook que se hicieron, ¿verdad? Videos en vivo del recorrido que los migrantes llevaban, de la decisión que tomaron estos migrantes de tomar los trenes y viajar desde la capital mexicana hasta Tijuana en tren. Eso fue transmitido en Facebook, en vivo, y eso pudo permitir el contacto directo, ¿verdad?, de algunos familiares, de seguir la pista de por dónde iban y cómo viajaban sus familiares. En el país, pues, esta cobertura periodística permitió o inquietó a muchos hondureños y empezaron a buscar orientación de cómo solicitar refugio, cómo funciona lo del asilo y a quiénes hacerlo, a quiénes presentarse. Y justamente eso fue lo que se hizo. Se orientó, si alguien pretendía irse, porque inevitablemente, aunque uno le explique o una le explique a las personas los riesgos, las decisiones están tomadas, la situación cada vez se agrava y la gente decide irse. Y es mejor que se vaya informada, conozca dónde acudir, evite los riesgos para evitar pues la muerte. Entonces se estuvo orientando, ¿verdad?, de la forma en que tenía que ir, llegar, presentarse a las autoridades, no huir por los montes, no tomar los trenes y que se fuera de frente sin esconderse. Que era la mejor manera de irse, seguros, agrupados, para evitar los secuestros, las extorsiones, las violaciones tumultuosas que han sucedido y evitar ser asesinados. El 12 de octubre del 2018 sabíamos que un grupo se reuniría para emprender el viaje desde San Pedro Sula. La expectativa era unas 600 personas que saldrían caminando desde San Pedro Sula hasta la frontera con Guatemala. Ese mismo día se comenzaron a juntar. Ya a la medianoche pasaron a ser 1.500 personas. Al llegar a la frontera ya eran 3.000 personas. Y al llegar a la frontera mexicana ya pasaban 17.000 personas. Algo nunca visto en estos años. En su gran mayoría integrada por hondureños. El gobierno de mi país, en su afán de atacar, de crear falsas teorías de conspiración, terminaron dándole una fuerte cobertura mediática. Muchos tomaron la mochila y en el camino se sumaron a la caravana. Se dijo que había dinero para patrocinar la caravana, que había transporte, alimentación gratuita. Era entonces tentador sumarse a esa caravana con esos enunciados del gobierno. Nada era cierto. La gente de buen corazón salió a recibir a los migrantes, a dar agua, alimentos, a prestar auxilio en el camino, a prestar sus camiones, carros de paila y de forma solidaria ayudar a transportarlos. En Guatemala, como todos sabemos o hemos escuchado las noticias, mi compañero fue detenido. La policía guatemalteca y agentes de la embajada participaron en su captura hasta trasladarlo a un recinto en la ciudad de Guatemala, donde permaneció aislado por 3 días hasta el día de su deportación en Honduras. Sabemos que la inteligencia militar de Honduras envió información a las autoridades de un supuesto complot para desestabilizar los gobiernos del área centroamericana y hasta el propio gobierno de Trump. Todo esto una completa farsa. El plan era encarcelarlo, acusarlo de traficante de personas, ponerlo a la disposición del gobierno de los Estados Unidos. Pero fue fundamental el apoyo que recibimos de las organizaciones de derechos humanos en Guatemala y en Honduras, de colegas periodistas de la prensa alternativa, para que ese plan y ese objetivo no se ejecutaran. Nada de lo que hemos hecho raya en lo ilegal. Acompañamos y ayudamos a orientar a los migrantes en la defensa de sus derechos. Era para evitar que se convirtieran en nuevas cifras de desaparecidos y asesinados, que ya lo conocemos. Que hicieran uso de los recursos y herramientas legales ante las autoridades para protegerse y para hacer su viaje de lo menos riesgoso. Yo estuve ahí en la primera caravana. Ayudamos a sacar listados por regiones para que se conocieran, se cuidaran. Es difícil que en un mar de gente no haya situaciones que se desborden, producto del cansancio, del hambre y la desesperanza. Al menos las 2 primeras caravanas de octubre del 2018 y enero, la gente llevaba el firme propósito de actuar de manera ordenada y seguir disciplinadamente las instrucciones de la autoridad. El paso de la primera caravana despertó mucha solidaridad tanto en Guatemala como en México. Sin embargo, han sido los mismos gobiernos a través de sus campañas de odio que han alimentado la xenofobia y el racismo. También sabemos que las posteriores caravanas que han salido de Honduras han sido infiltradas por agentes policiales y de inteligencia militar para provocar caos, desorden y hacer ver a los migrantes como amenazas y delincuentes peligrosos. Ahora lo que vemos es que los gobiernos han endurecido las medidas y las restricciones, lo que está provocando mayor muerte, enfrentamientos, incremento de los secuestros y extorsiones. Esto, pues, hay imágenes que están circulando en el país. Decirles que la situación en Honduras no ha mejorado. Estamos a la puerta de un nuevo proceso electoral que desde ya se torna con mucha incertidumbre. Nadie quiere volver a vivir episodios de violencia y un nuevo fraude electoral. Si de ocurrir esto, que sería lo más trágico para nuestro país, un proceso viciado y que sea legitimado por Estados Unidos, podríamos estar a la puerta de nuevamente éxodos fuertes hacia Estados Unidos, que nadie quiere vivirlo y que es realmente desgarrador para este país. Las deportaciones han incrementado y la gente continúa en las ansias de salir del país si la situación no mejora. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Dunia, particularly for pointing out the importance of using popular, accessible media to amplify the concerns of migrants themselves and pointing to the terrible human impacts on individuals and on families of the crossing or the attempt to cross. Our final presentation is by Alicia Schmidt Camacho, who will present Migrant Imaginaries in the Pursuit of Justice. Dr. Camacho is a professor of ethnicity, race, and migration at Yale University. She's a scholar of Latinx migration and social movements with an emphasis on transnational Mexican communities and Latinx cultural politics. Her writings examine transnational labor organizing and the impact of immigration law enforcement on migrant communities in Mexico and the United States. She's also written about gender violence in the Mexican border region, and she's the author of Migrant Imaginaries, Latino Cultural Politics in the US-Mexico Borderlands. In 2017, she formed the Migrant Justice Initiative, which is a multidisciplinary project that brings scholars into conversation with migrant-led organizations. Her current book project, entitled Migrant Justice, draws on a lot of this work. Dr. Camacho, please.
Thank you so much, Geri, and thank you. I want to say thank you to the organizers of this extraordinary program, and especially also thank my co-panelists. It's an honor to be with you and to be hearing you articulate so forcefully the urgent work of migrant politics. I'm speaking from the ancestral lands of the Quinnipiac and Algonquin speaking peoples, and from a community that includes Quechua, Mam, Quiche, Zapotec peoples, as well as Tlaxcalan Nahua speakers. I want to also think about the migrant organizers whose messages are lighting up my phone today. People who are working very hard to find out what potential gains may be made through the meager offerings of the new legislation, the Build Back Better, whether in fact this time legislators will be willing to pay their debts to migrant communities in this country and procure some form of immigration relief and legalization that is long overdue. I'm going to try and keep my remarks very quick. I had a PowerPoint. I'm going to dispense with it just to so that we can get time to have conversation. My scholarship examines migrancy as a social practice. The movement of peoples across the Americas has always been a critical form of social struggle against domination, as we've heard powerfully today. And in this conference and in this panel, we've heard the many ways that forced displacement of peoples and the criminalization of ordinary migrants and refugees has fundamentally altered the historic relationships of peoples to land and of peoples to place. And within that, the capacity of peoples to define their own terms of kinship, their own sense of solidarity, their own ties across different regional formations, translocal, transnational, and within the boundaries of what have become nations. So in my view, the violence to migrants, as we've heard about this conference, is inseparable from the appropriation of land from indigenous peoples and the forced expulsion of marginalized and persecuted peoples. An expulsion that, as Rodrigo Lantan said in the video clip that we heard, is unnatural. The political construction of territory, of private land ownership, is so bound up in the kinds of settler and colonial regimes. These have been mobilized against the most basic of human relations, to land as life, to land as a source of collective being and identity. We've heard this articulated powerfully here from the Maya Chortí struggle and from Black diaspora politics, that the autonomous relationship to land is a sacred relation that requires maintenance and defense and recovery, that forced displacement is a continuation of longstanding state and colonial violences. So in this case, libertad de tránsito, or liberty of transit, is in fact an extension of that sacred and fundamental relation. It is a means for recovering lost land and collective power. Migrant politics are bound up in far more expansive stakes of struggle than the pursuit of refuge, of amnesty might suggest, as I want to try and suggest very quickly. So I just want to again note that the vast majority of the conversation about migrants and about the growing tide of human mobility around the world is bound up with nations and with the instrument of legalization, the question of who can be a citizen, whose rights can be recognized and protected, who can belong within the political frameworks that sovereign states have created. But in fact, here in this conference, we're talking about very different terms of struggle around a continuing anti-colonial project, struggles to recover land and language and peoplehood, struggles to create different geographies for thinking about the reunification, for pursuing reparations over a long, much longer history of struggles that define labor rights as requiring work across borders to be enforced and recovered and protected. Ways of defining collective interest and collective belonging beyond the boundaries of an individual rights-bearing subject. So politics around migration, again, are bound up, I think, in all of the major world struggles of our moment. And this is a world animated by migrant struggle. And so the plurality and complexity of migrants and migrant actors makes it very difficult to think about their politics in the singular. So if we're living through a critical conjuncture in this regime of carceral violence, as the events unfolding across the Americas right now show us scenes of extraordinary expulsion, the mobilization of armies to hold back ordinary migrants in pursuit of basic survival. I also want to say, as our colleague Dunya just said so powerfully about the caravanas, that in fact, migrants are also changing the world and holding back the worst of authoritarian regimes and the worst of extractive capitalist exploitation and violence. So in my view, the extremity of anti-immigrant violence across the Americas has meant that we're also going to live in a moment where migrant-led organizing and migrant-led politics have to pose new challenges to authoritarian governance and to the international division of labor, that the pursuit of survival is in fact fundamentally subversive of state sovereignty and of private property or the accumulation regimes within which we live. The caravan is one example of that. There has been no shortage of dialogue in the press right now to mobilize, again, a mass show of force against this collective of vulnerable people whose solidarity defies the logic of state governance, right? Governments don't know what to do with people who refuse to remain in place and suffer. Migrants in the caravans, migrants in diaspora are constructing plurinations and transnations. They're recovering indigenous self-determination. These are formations and concepts that have been entirely absent from public debate, from policy and law, but they have shaped the vernacular of powerful social movements. And so if migrant politics at the state level have not moved in the direction we wish them to move, that have in fact consolidated reactive rearticulation of state violence and citizen violence against migrants, migrant politics have moved many social movements, including the movements for Black lives, the movement against police violence, against carceral regimes, the movements for labor of traditional labor unions, the movements around faith and religion in the form of church-based organizing. Migrants have moved these entities beyond an immigrant rights framework of legal incorporation. And at the local and trans-regional levels, translocal, transnational, migrants are involved in a politics of reparation, of abolition, of reviving social solidarity. In the words of the National Day Labor Organizing Network campaign during the pandemic, itself a citation of older anti-authoritarian regime mobilizations across Latin America. Solo el pueblo salva al pueblo. Only the people can save the people. And I think scholars and advocates have often underestimated the power of migrant mobility as a resource against domination. They've tended to relegate movements for the recovery of land, for the assertion of labor rights, the creation of solidarity economies to the margins, while pursuing in greater primacy the politics of incorporation to the nation state. I think these two have to work much more in tandem. And so I want to cite the term migrant justice, the term justice that shows up in the Black Alliance for Immigrant Justice, that shows up in the Migrant Justice organization of dairy workers, most of them indigenous people from southern Mexico and from Guatemala, who are in Vermont organizing in very difficult circumstances to achieve labor power. But the term justice is a horizon beyond the law. It's a horizon, if we go back to Kristen's work, that has a different temporal framework that allows migrants to achieve and exercise social power without obtaining formal citizenship, although it is looking for the protections and seeking to expand the terms of participating in the society of rights-bearing peoples. It speaks of migrants as transnational workers, as binational civic actors. It speaks of them as members of indigenous nations, and speaks in the defense of mobility, liberty de tránsito, libertad de tránsito, articulated through significantly distinct conceptions of peoplehood across, apart from the state, in terms of queer migrant kinship and other forms of kinship, as described by the work of Undocu Black Network and others, to expand the possibilities for defense across Black diasporas in the Americas and beyond. So I wanted to speak of a few sites where we could look at migrant justice in action, and I'm going to, for the sake of conversation, keep it very short. I want to think about pandemic New York City, in which migrants led an effort to protect essential and excluded workers, achieving an unprecedented $2.1 billion relief fund and legislation to protect delivery workers. They did so by using their very own vulnerability, by putting their bodies on the line. They mobilized a hunger strike in which dozens of jornaleras, most of them Central American and Mexican, but also women from the Caribbean, organized a hunger strike that led to legislative initiatives, again, calling on the state to act, to remember that this is a population of people who cannot vote, who are under constant threat of expulsion, who own very little, but they got unions and legislators to act through acts of deep solidarity with vulnerable workers who were citizens, who were underserved by beleaguered unions that no longer organize. And at the root of that is an older history of mutual aid organizations, which themselves have their root in collective forms of social action, connection based in pueblos, the forms of political organization that predate the nation state. Again, the deliveristas, the Unidos of New York, who said, we are nobody's problem, and proceeded to organize and get legislation to protect them against the predations of Grubhub and other apps that sent food delivery workers out in the pandemic, unprotected, subject to extraordinary unsafe conditions because they travel on bicycles through the heavy traffic streets of New York City. They did this through as a defense against their criminalization. We are nobody's problem. We are workers providing essential support to a city in the pandemic, but it's also a statement about abandonment. These ununionized, unprotected workers, unincorporated, not protected as citizens, are abandoned. We are nobody's problem. We are outside the circle of rights. No one will protect us. But they forced the state to act publicly to account for their precarious status, and they undid the notion that legal relief should be ever construed as a gift from above. It is based in a principle of equity and economic solidarity. In my own city of New Haven, there is a sister diaspora organization, Sisters in Diaspora Collective, that has been organizing for housing justice in a city suffering the displacement of many low-income people, where Section 8 housing contains several households that is deeply overcrowded, and where the problem of unhoused populations continues to expand, a city that has received people displaced by hurricanes in the Caribbean without significant relief from the government. Local immigrant women came together with US women, citizen women of color, Puerto Rican and Black, to create a movement to expand housing access and to demand greater supports from both local, state and federal government. And finally, I want to acknowledge the solidarity provided to Haitian migrants through the work of Black organizations like the Undocumented Black Network, the Black Alliance for Just Immigration, who found solidarity from many Indigenous nations, including some of the leadership on this panel. The Mayan League issued a letter to legislators and to the Biden administration demanding justice and an end to the deportations of Haitians who had been promised refuge by the US government by articulating kinship, by naming these people. These are not aliens, these are not foreign, these are members of our family, of our human family. They are fellow peoples in struggle. And that articulation of other sovereignties, the deep solidarity born of a shared history of colonial struggle and enslavement, has produced, again, another way of articulating the stakes of including refugees, of not abandoning them, of recognizing refugees as the subjects of a much larger ongoing struggle to have rights and to demand inclusion. In conclusion, I want to cite the words of a man from Honduras who came in one of the caravans that Doña Araceli Montoya Medina spoke about. He said to the press, "Venimos en forma de lucha." Our movement is struggle. We come in pursuit of struggle. Migrant imaginaries don't conform easily to the state-centered politics of our time. They don't register in the hegemonic discourses of media, except through the voices of people like these on my panel with me. But they are powerful articulators of a historic vision and a very contemporary vision for a different order of belonging and relationship to land. Thank you.
Thank you, Alicia. In the interest of time, I'm going to ask us to go straight to Q&A. We had a very, very powerful and deliberately so set of panelists. So I hope that even though we will not have extended time for Q&A, that you appreciate it as much as I did and took in everything that everyone had to say. I thought while I was giving the panel, the audience, a chance to put up questions in the Q&A, so they kind of don't get mixed up with the chat, which is now extensive. I would ask the panelists whether any of you, and this is just to get us started in the remaining minutes, have a burning question that you'd like to ask of another panelist. And for that, I'm just going to ask you to raise your hand, and I'm going to keep an eye on the Q&A so that our audience can come in just as soon as they are ready. Erica, I see you have your hand up. Would you like to start?
Hi, how are you? Thanks everyone for this impressive panel. I have two questions, or maybe three.
No, if you have two or three, I'm going to ask you to do one or at most two so that we have the chance.
Okay, I will just do two questions. One is for Juanita and Emil, which is the following. So I was just wondering how you act and work together with other Mayan groups in other regions of Guatemala. So your collaboration with other indigenous groups for the same cause of defense of the land and climate change. And the other question I had was for Dunia. I was curious about how the migrants that you followed and filmed, las caravanas, and how, should I ask the question in Spanish?
Actually, you should hold that question. We'll get your first question be answered. I'll go to the questions that I'm already beginning to see from the audience, and then we can come back to you. So if Emil and Juanita can address the first question, right?
Juanita, you want to go ahead and take it?
Okay, I can. So thank you for the question and for the opportunity. So when we're looking at migration and really the complexities of the context in the region, we can't address migration without working with our communities, without working with our peoples. And so really there's been an intentional connection with Indigenous leadership from the traditional side. Again, going back to the topics of autonomy and self-determination. So right now we have been working closely with the Maya Chorti people through Comudich because of the situations that we talked about. But in the Western Highlands, we've also been working a lot with different council structures. So for instance, I know this wasn't part of the conversation, but in the United States, one of our key communities locally is the Maya Ixil people. So therefore we work with the alcaldías and the Maya Ixil structures in Guatemala. Same thing with the Maya Mum people. We work with the Maya Council and I'm Mum as well. So we work with traditional authorities. And then if we look within the NGO structures, Asociación Popno has been working a lot on, again, route drivers of forced migration and working from the Western Highlands for those who are being deported and returning back to Guatemala. And I think, Emil, you could add some information around the Maya Kekchi situation and some of the context that we have there.
Yeah, I don't know if you know this, but also the Kekchi Maya territory is being is under siege right now. There's a mining company, Russian, Swedish mining company that's trying to operate there, and there's been a lot of resistance, a lot of people being incarcerated. And we've been in touch with some of the authorities down there, as well as with journalists from Prensa Comunitaria, which is an Indigenous-led journalist organization that is, highlighting what's going on in Indigenous territories. And so we usually consult with, as Juanita said, with Indigenous authorities on the ground, like to learn what's going on. And we're also part of a collective, a scholarly collective, the Ixpalamkej Winak, which is binational, with Maya scholars and activists working in Guatemala and us working here. But usually when it comes to the issue of immigration, we usually develop binational responses based on what we're told and what it is suggested for us to do from this side of the border.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
We have a question from the audience for Alicia, and I'm sure if anyone else wishes also to respond. The deep solidarity you described between Indigenous and Afro-descendant movements is so crucial to refusing state-centered politics. How can we help bring this into political discourse and border policy that is so toxic right now? Where can we push this to actually change the border regime?
May I ask my fellow panelists if any of you want to answer that? I feel like I am citing ongoing struggles that others are involved in.
I'll read it again. It's about the solidarity between Indigenous and Afro-descendant movements and making this part of a broader political discourse, and whether that can be brought into border policy that is toxic right now. Can we push this to actually change the border regime?
So I can start by some of the actions that we have recently done. And thank you so much for citing the statement that we had put out in terms of the inhumane border policies that disproportionately impact Indigenous Black migrant communities, especially because we've been so marginalized within the larger migrant movement space. Oftentimes we're not recognized, our identities are erased. For Indigenous peoples, we're mislabeled as Latino or Hispanic, which is an additional violation of our human rights as Indigenous peoples. And so part of the what has been so powerful to see from Black-led immigrant organizations has been that they've positioned themselves in leadership roles that have been supported by Black Lives Matter movement, by folks in politics in the United States that have really elevated what they themselves are positioning are the calls for action and change. And I think from Indigenous peoples in migration, that's where we're striving to go. But because we've been so sidelined from larger conversations around policy and also how we're treated in our ancestral lands and territories, it calls for that need for solidarity across movements, because it is about racial justice. It is about human rights. It is about ensuring that those who have been the most victimized are reasserting leadership in that space to say exactly what it is that our communities need, both on the US side and in our countries of origin, because oftentimes many people will speak for us and not let us speak for ourselves. And so I think that's a really powerful moment that has been created because of the labor and the sacrifice of so many of us, of so many before us. And so do recognize that that leadership, those spaces exist now because of so much hard work before we came.
The person who wrote the question, I don't know if she wanted me to say it or not, but it's Professor Mimi Scheller. And I hope that that answer was a good one, a satisfactory one for you. Erica, we have a moment. Maybe we could come back to your second question. That was for Dunia, I think. You're muted.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. Should I ask the question in Spanish? Yes, okay. Quería preguntarte, Dunia, pues gracias por su testimonio. Quería preguntarte cómo los migrantes en las caravanas, o sea, cuando ustedes los filmaron, ¿no? Desde los siguieron filmándoles desde las caravanas, pues cómo ellos se tomaron, digamos, este gesto de ustedes, por un lado, y también si tu compromiso, cómo ha cambiado un poco, como tu percepción de todo, si ha cambiado desde la detención y la deportación de tu compañero Bartolo.
Bueno, decirles que la gente estaba muy agradecida. O sea, nadie se había tomado el tiempo de acompañarles. Hay mucho temor en el país, ¿verdad? Hasta de las mismas organizaciones de migrantes que trabajan en el tema de defensa de derechos humanos, porque acompañarlos directamente era como irse a una afrenta directa con las autoridades que establecen unas políticas restrictivas contra los migrantes. Fue muy dura la experiencia. Nosotros no pudimos acompañar hasta que llegaran a México, ¿verdad? Hasta ahí nomás a la entrada de Guatemala pudimos acompañar. La situación fue muy dura, de hecho no ha sido fácil para nosotros. Y le voy a decir que en Guatemala tampoco fue fácil. No fue que hubo cantidad de organizaciones de Guatemala, de defensoras de derechos humanos, que se atrevieron. Me lo dijo un amigo muy próximo, Dunia, es Estados Unidos que está atrás de esto, porque quienes participaron en la propia captura de mi compañero habían sido representantes de la embajada norteamericana, entonces nadie se atrevía. Lo hemos sabido también que uno de los abogados que acompañó la defensa de mi compañero en Guatemala fue suspendida su visa. Luego un periodista hondureño que ayudó a generar una conferencia de prensa en México también fue suspendida su visa. Entonces, nadie fácilmente se atreve a hacer eso. Luego nosotros tenemos medidas de restricción. Mi esposo no puede entrar a Guatemala. Si entra a El Salvador mismo, hay mucha dificultad para entrar a El Salvador. Para México también, tienen que llegar personas de Interpol y hay unas medidas de control bastante fuertes para poder ingresar al área centroamericana y mexicana. Entonces, no ha sido fácil, ¿verdad? En el país se han tenido que desafiar algunas situaciones. Mi esposo tuvo que querellar a una alta autoridad hondureña que se atrevió a decir en un medio de comunicación que él estaba recibiendo dinero, $4,000, $5,000 por llevar a cada migrante hacia Estados Unidos, y finalmente tuvo que ser llevado a los tribunales de justicia y la persona tuvo que, bueno, retractarse de lo que había dicho. No ha sido fácil a nivel de trabajo y de establecer redes. O sea, no es fácil enfrentarse a un país tan poderoso que subyuga a los propios gobiernos centroamericanos para establecer políticas duras contra sus propios hermanos. Gracias.
Es usted.
I'm scanning the chat and the Q&A, and I don't see anything else coming from the audience. So I think we have the possibility of giving a last word, a brief last word to each of our panelists. And in particular, this is kind of me folding a question into your final comment, but what is the change I've been thinking that you would each of you would most like to see in how mobility and migration are being taught and thought on both sides of the border? You can fold that into your one final comment if you like. But in other words, can we go across the panel? Maybe I can take them in order. I don't remember who spoke first though, so just jump in with a final comment, please. It's Rebecca, I think, who was first.
Okay, I'm hesitant to offer the first word. I'd love to defer to others speak first. I just wanted to thank everyone for inviting me into this space and back to Brown, where I also got my degree, and just I really appreciate the really amazing presentations and inclusive space that you've created for this. And I think, many have already alluded to this, but in terms of, how we teach migration, and I think, and learn about it. And I think really moving away from, and I think many have alluded to this, a state-centered view on this, and looking at, more transformative ways that people are speaking from within and across these spaces, as well as I appreciate bringing more diverse voices into that conversation. And so I'm just really lucky also to learn from all of you. So thank you.
Juanita, Emil.
Yeah, no, I think following on what Rebecca was saying, right, is finding ways to include like the perspective of the organizations working on the ground about these topics, because they know the problems that are occurring on the ground, and they are the ones dealing and creating solutions for it, and try to find ways to support them, maybe by donating or finding ways for them to create a space for them to speak about these issues, and invite them to your classes. It's I cited like we cited 3 organizations like Embodied, Coming each in Honduras, and Anis, and there are many others. These are just 3 of many other organizations that are working on the ground, because they know what's happening, and at the same time they are creating their own solutions to the problem. It's not that, as I was saying in my presentation, we're not mere victims of what's going on. We're trying to create solutions. It's just that sometimes, because of state policies, we're not being, they don't let us do. They interfere in our efforts to create solutions for our own problems. But yeah, that would be my suggestion, to try to involve these organizations in our curriculum and make them part of it.
Juanita?
Yeah, well, first, thank you so much for, inviting me to be part of this space. Thank you, Emil, for inviting me to be your co-presenter. I would say that part of the power and the role of academia as well is allowing for Indigenous-led scholarship or scholarship led by those who are directly impacted and on the front lines of this to build up a host of literature and research that can be cited within the frameworks of academia. I know that in a lot of our countries, the power of universities and how they interact with governments is also leads to policy changes, leads to more structural change that if it has the name of Brown University or Yale or Hopkins will make a difference in terms of a power shift in policy and aid. I would also say that I guess, there's a huge, both in the United States and in the diaspora and in our countries of origin, there are a lot of young people that have tremendous ideas and dreams and solutions that are also part of the work that we're doing. And so the intergenerational approach is very, very important for change. And that goes back to education, opportunities, and institutions. And I would say that those would be some of the recommendations that we try to integrate in our work, is also really working on youth leadership and building that up. So just happy to be here and look forward to continued conversations.
We're extremely happy to have you too. I see that our time is actually up at 1 o'clock. So I wanted to close just by thanking you all personally, thanking you on behalf of CLACS, and I hope the audience also joins me. I see some comments here about enlightening panel, amazing panel, helping to imagine futures beyond the nation state. So I think you've achieved the collective objective here. And I just hope for more panels that bring together activists, scholars, and activist scholars of this type. And finally, a thank you to both of our translators who worked very hard and did a great job, and to Kristen for pulling this particular one together. Good afternoon, and I hope you enjoy the rest. We do have rest, right? The rest of the conference today.
Thank you. See y'all at 2.
Thank you.